So I want to say something new again about the role of our sacred text. So those who penned what we know as the earliest Gospels were doing so in order to provide some testimony from the early church. So keep in mind that none of these Gospels were written before 70 years after Jesus died. So what we have are a collection of stories within the oral tradition. We have a collection of Jesus parables, and then we have a collection of what John Dominic Crossan calls the parables about Jesus. So within that particular culture, and I've said this before, after the Age of Enlightenment, the only question we thought was important was, is this true? Can it be proved? Those questions were never in the hearts of minds of the ancients. It hardly mattered if anything was historical. It could still be true. And there was a recognition that parables and poetry and myth, now those were containers of what was true. And yet, us 21st century people were going, gee, did that really happen? Doesn't matter. So the other thing I think we need to look for then and pay attention to is when we are stumbling upon archetypes. Now, I know I've used this word before, and I think somebody invited me to unpack it at one point. So what do I mean by an archetype? Let me just use the word model. All right? So models, archetypes are those, shall we say, metaphors and images that keep propping up. All right. So let me just throw one out just to give us an example. Savior. Savior is an archetype, all right? We know when we look for that role to be fulfilled. Let's consider the United States, right? When Obama was running for presidency, right? Oh my goodness, someone gonna save us. Well, and then, boy, didn't they look for another one in the last election. Archetypes, larger than life concepts. All right, so I'll say something more about that in the context of this particular passage. But it's important when we recognize that we're coming face to face with an archetype. And I'll also say more about that later, maybe. So like I said earlier, this is the last Sunday in the season of Epiphany. And the people who put together what is known as the lectionary readings for the church year, I don't always follow it, by the way, but within the season of Epiphany, if you are following the lectionary readings, begins with the baptism of Jesus. All right, so the season of Epiphany, the color is green, is meant to be a season where we experience the unfolding of Jesus' identity. There are some signs, some wonders, and every week kind of like, that epiphany, that aha moment when it comes to the identity of Jesus. And then those who prepared the readings for the lectionary concluded this season of Epiphany with this passage about transfiguration. It's a passage I have this love-hate relationship with. And what's interesting about the way that this season has been framed is that in both of those passages, at the baptism and then at the transfiguration, we hear the same words. All right, so at Jesus' baptism, the words that come from heaven, from the sky, the words that are used by the gospel writers are, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased." And then lo and behold, at the end of this season, in the passage of the Transfiguration, those same words, "This is my son, listen to him." So I'm going to suggest then that what we've got in those two passages are what I'm going to call an archetype of affirmation. All right, so these are ways for those who wrote the Gospels the affirmation is not simply about what they're going to pin on Jesus, because these pieces of literature were for the early church. So it's a way of offering affirmation for the early church. So I'm going to read this passage to you, and then I'm going to make some commentary along the way, because many of these passages are loaded with symbolism, and if you are listening to them as a first century Jew or Palestinian, you're going to go, as soon as you hear those big archetypes, you're going to go, oh, but they won't necessarily translate well to us. So, here's another archetype, by the way. Mountaintop experience, right? We know what that means as soon as we say it. And then, valley. We understand that too as well. So the passage I'm going to read to you starts on the mountain, ends up in the valley. Well, we know that's true about life, don't we? So what is it that happens on the mountain here then is meant to inform what happens in the valley and vice versa? Keep in mind all the other times that we have become familiar with mountaintop experiences, all right? So there's Moses who goes up the mountain to get the tablets, the law. And then we have Elijah who is seeking refuge from the people who are trying to kill him and goes up the mountain to hear a still small voice, all right? So what I'm trying to tell you is that all of these different themes are wound into one, this tiny little passage. So 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Jesus, it is so good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from a cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear, but Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself. When they came down the mountain, they encountered again the crowd. A man came to him, knelt before him, and said, "Jesus, have mercy on my son. For he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I put up with you? How much longer must I be with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. So it seems to me that this particular passage played a role in both primarily the early church. And let me just say something about how we're going to go there. I actually wrote an entire script last night and woke up this morning and I didn't like it, so I'm kind of starting from scratch again. Excuse me. So let's look at this, an archetype of affirmation. And I think that it comes in a perfect time within the season of the Christian year. But also, very often, when do we not need archetypes of affirmation in our own lives? Because life, as we know, is a series of mountains and valleys. And I know that you all know and have very personal stories about that. And so here we have on the mountain Jesus, and it is marking in some ways a threshold of his life. All right, so he has had a good season of ministry, and now he is prepared to turn his face toward Jerusalem. So he could have been hanging out in the countryside, just healing and teaching people, but in fact, he makes a decision to face the powers that be. And so it seems to me that what the gospel writers are trying to do is say, look, this is absolute affirmation from God that Jesus is moving in the right direction. But I think it's interesting who they choose to put on the mountain with him. And I think it's bigger than just these icons within the tradition of Judaism that are, Moses represented the law and Elijah represented the prophets. More than anything else, I think Moses and Elijah represent those folk who have been called to take on a very unique calling and have had to go it alone. All right? So I think that is the reason why I appreciate these two on the mountain. Moses, who was called to lead a people, to help them understand their identity in light of the mystery we call God. Elijah, again, meant to continue to shape the people of Israel and how they understood their role as being a light to the nations. And yet both of these people, Moses and Elijah, absolutely abused by those people who they were leading. And so I think it makes absolute sense that they end up on the mountain with a man. This is myth and metaphor and poetry, right? With the man who is about to descend the mountain and has lived with his own community being completely confused and then abusing him as well. So, first and foremost, this passage was written for the early church. All right? So the early church, still 80, 90 years after Jesus' death, forming communities that were bold and unique and countercultural in the midst of this empire, and seeking to be a light of another way of creating community together. I don't think we can imagine how remarkable the role of the early church was. This is before Constantine got his hands on it, right? Pulling in people regardless of their status, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, regardless of their health, and creating safe spaces and sanctuary places for people. And so I think this particular passage serves as massive affirmation that we are building our lives around the teaching of this man, and see, here is a story that we can share and carry forth together of this man being profoundly, profoundly affirmed by God and affirmed by the ancestors. The other piece of it, of course, is that those who wrote the Gospels were constantly trying to place Jesus within the larger history of the people of Israel, as opposed to saying, look, he wasn't actually that crazy radical. He was actually recovering that which was at the heart of the law and prophets and inviting us how to think through those things again. So I guess as I was thinking about this passage, the question that arose for me more than anything else was, how do we read the signs in our own lives that affirm, confirm that we are on track? All right? Jesus went on to descend the mountain into challenges, moved towards Jerusalem with further challenges. And you kind of wonder about the kinds of experiences that he held in his heart that gave him the courage that he needed to stay that course. So I wonder what the signs are that confirm for us that we have acted with courage and faith, and that we are called to continue to embrace our course. So I think I'll say something about how we might read the signs as a congregation, right? So we are a congregation that a number of years ago bought a building to start a store. And then we turned around and we started a program for vulnerable girls, though we didn't know where the money was coming from. And now we're halfway through our ninth year. And then we took out the pews, and apparently that is very radical. And then we developed relationships with our neighbors on Tyendinaga. And then we put a huge mural on our back wall that is not Christian. And then we provided a labyrinth for people of every creed. We are moving towards a vision of a program we're calling Dinners Ready that simply brings people around the table to break bread together. Why? Because we think that we are more healthy and more human when we eat together. So my question is, how have we known As we have broken and will continue to break new ground as a congregation, how can we know that our acts of courage and faith and moving off the beaten track, and we have, how can we know that we're on track? Well, it seems to me that it's the story that happens in the valley that provides the real affirmation here. So what happens in the valley? A child is healed. In the middle of the mayhem and the misunderstanding and the profoundly human struggle, a child is healed. And so the question I think that we ask with every step that we take as a circle of friends is this: who will be healed? Who else can we include in our circle of healing and restoration, which we believe comes in providing sanctuary for one another, a safe place for one another, a prayer shawl, a meal, a place at the table? And what is curious is that very often the test of faith and courage within a church has been, can we afford it? Or, are we allowed to? Or, who will be angry? That's always been a big one. Or, will this add to our membership? And yet, we know that Jesus never navigated his courage based on answers to those questions. So I think that we know when we are on track as a circle of friends. And almost weekly, we receive thank you notes, letters from acknowledgement because of those both near and far whom we have found a way of touching with our healing ministries. But I guess the bigger question, and we'll all walk away with this question as well, is what about on a personal level? How can we know we are on the right track? And that's a tough one, I think. Yet it's an important question because our spiritual tradition invites us to walk along a road that does not promise certainty. One of my favorite songs by Quaker Carrie Newcomer is, "I'm learning to live without knowing." I'm learning to live without knowing. So, I think two things. When we think about finding ourselves in those places of not knowing, when we find ourselves in those places thinking, would somebody just send the facts and tell me what is required of me right now? I think it's important that we lean into those men and women in our tradition who found themselves in exactly the same place. People like Moses and Elijah and Jesus. But I think it's not all of us that are called to be heroes, right? Even though, honestly, I'm looking at a community full of heroes because I know all of those things that you have had to navigate in your own life. And they have required each of you to be heroes. But I guess the question is, what happens when we do find ourselves, and I love these words from Cyndi Lauper's song Fearless, "Sometimes I'm afraid of the dark. I can't find the light in my heart." And I think this is where we as a circle of friends need to hold that archetype of affirmation for one another. And recognize that we do not walk this road alone. And recognize that our expressions of vulnerability and fear and concern may very well be the gateway to our restoration and our healing. Because when we live with that vulnerability and learn to lean on one another, then in fact we are carried through those challenging seasons of our life. And I think we know that as a circle of friends, that is the role we are called to play with one another. That we are called to pay attention and to notice when others are in need of our coming alongside with an affirmation of their courage and their faith. So I think we always look for ways to be vigilant about that invitation which is ultimately to be sanctuary for one another. But I know that there are times when, in fact, we do not want to share our struggle with others. There are times when we find ourselves in the middle of the night asking those questions and being terrified that we're not going to get it right. And during times like that, when there is no human body or no community on which to lean, I think then we need to retrieve those words spoken both at Jesus' baptism and now again on the mountain when he is about to when he is actually at the beginning of the end of his ministry. Those words that say that we are beloved. And we need to find ways of holding those words so closely to ourselves and being able to release them when they are needed and wrap ourselves in them. And I'm not sure our tradition has done a good enough job of confirming and affirming that deep identity we have as being beloved of God. I think the other invitation that comes from this set of images that takes us from mountain to valley is an invitation to lean into love and to recognize that in our not knowing, it's not necessarily a signal that we didn't get it right or we aren't on the track. But it's an invitation, I think, to trust and to surrender to a power and a love and a light that has been part of carrying us to this place. And I really like that. I don't know, it's not a cartoon that says, so far, my record indicates that I have made it through 100% of all of my bad days. So during this time for contemplation, as we consider these last moments in light and anticipate that it is meant to prepare us for a journey down the valley, I invite you to consider the challenging paths and decisions that are in your own life right now. And I leave you with these words by Ken Sehested. Hold fast to the one who made you. Stand with the beloved, and your footing shall be firm. Rest in the merciful one, and you shall be buoyed. Where do you go along these rugged paths, pilgrim, so far from home, yet so winsomely loved?